From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. It's Friday, June 5th, 2015. The world of international sports was shaken to the core recently with the arrest of several officials from FIFA. The top international governing body on soccer will turn to Professor Laurent Dubois to find out why it all matters. And Mexican-American performance artist Nao Bustamante looks into Soldaderas, the women of the Mexican Revolution. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Cristina Mislan, Assistant Professor of Journalism Studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. Hi, Cristina.
Hello, Sonali.
The U.S. has just revealed that one of its computer systems was hacked last December, affecting millions of federal employees, and that the cyber attack was linked back to the Chinese government. It is the largest ever breach of U.S. government data. The Office of Personnel Management, or OPM, which was the target of the hack, will be informing about 4 million current and former government workers that their Social Security numbers and other personnel data might have been exposed. The attack against OPM was only discovered in April and is similar to one uncovered in February aimed at the health insurance giant Anthem. Last March, another cyber theft of sensitive information aimed at OPM was discovered, also linked back to Chinese hackers. The Russian government has also been linked to cyber attacks against the U.S. State Department and the White House. Christina, in reading the story, I was wondering, wouldn't it be great if the NSA and other intelligence agencies focused their efforts more on protecting against hacking by foreign governments instead of spying on ordinary people?
Exactly. It's a great point. And I was just thinking the same thing. I think it's safe to say not only that, that the NSA should actually maybe focus on protecting U.S. citizens, but in protecting them, they should also focus on, in many ways, their own cyber attacks against U.S. citizens, right? And so, for instance, we know that Congress recently passed a bill that curtails the Patriot Act, but in recent days, we've also learned that outside of that, the Obama administration, in many ways secretly, because it wasn't public, secretly passed or has expanded NSA internet surveillance of U.S. Americans as well in terms of their international internet traffic. So here's an instance where we are worried about Russian hackers and Chinese hackers and all the international hackers, but what we really need to worry about is a system that is in our back doors.
And then Pakistani police revealed this morning that 8 of the 10 men who had been arrested in connection with the near-fatal shooting of Nobel Peace Prize winner Malala Yousafzai have been freed. The information directly contradicts what police said in April, that all 10 men were tried in a secret court and convicted to 25 years in prison. Yet it is now known that 8 men were released on April 30th by a court citing a lack of proof against them. 2 apparently remain incarcerated. It's already too late to appeal the acquittals. Yousafzai drew international fame when she was attacked by men claiming to be against girls' education. She survived the attack and has continued to speak out, winning acclaim and awards. Meanwhile, the Guardian newspaper, in a profile of Pakistan's justice system, today has found that the country's judicial system is on a killing spree. Since the horrific massacre at a Peshawar school last December, a moratorium on the death penalty was lifted, and at least 100 people have been executed in Pakistan so far, a rate of 2 people a day. Well, Christina, if the government is so eager to execute people, even those against whom evidence is thin, and yet they freed 8 of Malala's supposed attackers for lack of evidence, what do you think that means?
Well, I think it continues to point to the issues. I mean, I'm sure that many people would say it continues to point to the issues of women's rights, issues of when violence happens against women, how that in many ways is reflective of what some feminists would call vulnerable bodies. But, I also think it's important to let's put this conversation into context. I think it's easy for us in the so-called West, right, in the United States to say, well, that justice system is inherently flawed. And if we look at our own system, while albeit it might be in terms of degrees, right? The degrees vary. But if we look at our own system, we have actually similar issues, right? We have extrajudicial killings. We have seen killing sprees. We've seen the executions of innocent people on death row. And it's interesting that we have this conversation because I believe the governor of Nebraska now has decided that he would like to state that he wants to now kill people on death row in spite of the new banning of death penalty in Nebraska. And so, again, I think we need to put these conversations into context and not be the first ones to say, well, look at them over there. We also need to look at ourselves.
And finally, it is the first Friday of the month, and that means the latest U.S. jobs report is out. Economic indicators point to a slightly higher unemployment rate in May than in the month before. That's 5.5%. Still, wages actually rose a little, and the numbers of new jobs created in March and April were revised upwards. Taken together with higher auto sales last month, economists are hoping that the Federal Reserve will have enough assurance to increase interest rates in September. For years, the Fed has forced interest rates to remain near zero. Even though Reuters called the jobs report, quote, sturdy, the news outlet admitted that, quote, a broad measure of joblessness that includes people who want to work but have given up searching and those working part-time because they cannot find full-time employment was unchanged at 10.8%. So, Cristina, should we be celebrating as many economists are?
No, that's the simple answer. No, I think, we need to take various factors into consideration before we come to conclusions about how well our economy is doing. So, for instance, not only the conditions that you've just laid out, but also if we look at who's getting employed in terms of skill sets, types of jobs, right? Wages, how people define how well they're doing and how well they aren't doing, right? Perceptions, everyday effects, right? How people are affected every day, access to college, ability to even pay for their kids to go to college. All of these questions need to be considered. Right. And so the growth of the economy really should consider more than these percentages. We also should look at inequality, right? So for instance, the share of total income by the top 1% of families now exceeds 20%. Why are we not having that conversation as well?
Cristina, thank you as always for your insight and analysis. We'll talk to you again next week.
Thank you.
Cristina Mislan is an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. Sports is a big business, and soccer, which is the most popular sport in the world, is the biggest of them all. FIFA, which is the Federación Internacional de Football Association, the main governing body that organizes the World Cup, has come under intense scrutiny for its controversial high-stakes approach to the multi-billion-dollar business of soccer. And last week, when Swiss police arrested several top FIFA officials on behalf of the U.S. Justice Department, it left the sports industry shaken to the core. While longtime FIFA president Sepp Blatter was not among those arrested, he abruptly resigned this week as revelations and accusations of high-level bribery and corruption came thick and fast. Countries vie furiously to host the World Cup, a global tournament that is held every 4 years and that brings in billions of dollars in revenue. Now it has become apparent that FIFA officials accepted bribes in exchange for picking host countries. My guest is Laurent Dubois, professor at Duke University, editor of the Soccer Politics blog, and author of Soccer Empire. Welcome to Uprising, Laurent.
Thanks for having me.
Now, I don't personally follow soccer, but as someone who obviously does, can you tell me how controversial the picks for World Cup hosts are in general? Before this scandal broke, was it rumored that countries are picked to host based on maybe what might be going on behind the scenes rather than in them truly deserving it?
Well, especially during the past couple of decades, this has become increasingly the case. And I suppose it really became more and more visible when Russia and Qatar were picked for 2018 and 2022. Um, Especially the Qatar bid was one that kind of raised a lot of eyebrows. It's a very small country. It's a country that doesn't have much of a football tradition, not a very obvious pick. But in some ways obvious if you think about the kind of money that Qatar could have put into a bid, and they did do so clearly now. Um, I think that the controversies have erupted more and more also because FIFA has simply become richer and richer. More and more money has been pouring into their coffers. And this is a phenomenon that really began in the 70s and 80s, but it's all about the nexus, the relationship between the money from media companies and then the FIFA organization, which sells the rights to broadcasting these competitions. And that's really the whole nexus of the affair.
Well, that's a really interesting point that hasn't been raised very much in the news coverage of this. So, describe the relationship between the sort of giant media corporations that rely on people tuning in for these matches so that they can have millions and billions of eyeballs, and FIFA, which is supposed to be overseeing a sport that people love. A bunch of people kicking a ball around a large field.
Right. I mean, I think it's, one of the things to keep in mind is that FIFA obviously does not own soccer, doesn't own the sport. This is a kind of common good that's, in fact, basically we can say is probably the most shared cultural object across the globe. It is something that they have nevertheless kind of managed to kind of gain ownership over in a sense. And what they sell, I mean, originally FIFA was supposed to be a kind of cute organization meant to organize football matches between countries, right? That's its original goal, first in Europe and then expanding. And it's really starting, especially in the 70s and 80s, when the kind of the media interest, but also the amount of money that media can make through these kinds of things starts to skyrocket. That FIFA is kind of transforms into some kind of organization that's in principle an international nonprofit organization, but in fact functions as a kind of large corporate global entity of sorts, with an enormous amount of power. Now the media rights are essentially the most profitable thing from these tournaments, even more than ticket sales and so forth. That's where the big money is, because that's where advertisers are interested in, since it is, I mean, it's literally the most watched event on the planet, right? The World Cup finals, the 2014 World Cup final was watched by more people than ever watched anything before in the history of the world, right? So these are big events, and there's a lot of money that goes into it, and that's what you see. The indictments were not only of FIFA officials, but also of media sort of moguls who had been involved with these FIFA officials. And there's sometimes people who are both. I mean, people who have direct financial interest in the media and are also in FIFA. So you can really see where the kind of collusion and corruption took hold.
Right, there is a revolving door there. I want to dig a little bit into the accusations. Let's talk about U.S. former FIFA executive Chuck Blazer, who's been cooperating with the FBI, on whose testimony some of the U.S. Justice Department investigation is based. He admitted, actually in 2013, but that testimony I understand was just revealed, that he and others exchanged or accepted bribes in exchange for picking South Africa to host the 2010 World Cup. How important is his confession and his cooperation with investigators?
Well, it was really critical. I mean, it seems like more and more Chuck Blazer was the thing that opened up this whole case and got the U.S. involved. I mean, one of the great surprises, Stephen Colbert and among others have joked about this, but it's kind of a surprise that it's the United States that ends up, kind of taking on soccer in this way. This is obviously, we are a country that's more and more interested in soccer, but we're not really, the center of the game. And so it's Chuck Blazer's involvement that kind of, it seems to me anyway, to have brought the sort of started things rolling. And because he had been involved in a lot of things, and had access to information about FIFA, and had been kind of involved in outrageous ways. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
I'll just let that go.
Yeah.
The other thing about Chuck Blazer is that he was sort of so connected with the U.S. Soccer Federation and with International Soccer Federation that he kind of gave an in. And then there are other figures like Jack Warner and others. All of these figures, interestingly, are connected to the Americas for the most part. In fact, I think all of those indicted were. We have someone who's part owner of a local team here, the Carolina Railhawks in near Raleigh. So these are this sort of North and South American figures. But it's important to realize that the kinds of things that they're identifying here are really a feature of kind of global football. And the more the indictments go on, and the more things get exposed, I think we're going to see the same types of practices were in Europe, in Africa, in Asia.
Right.
So it really is kind of opening up something that I think is going to be a really big deal for quite a while.
And we should mention it's not just the South African pick for World Cup that is come under scrutiny for bribes, nor just Qatar, but even France. And Chuck Blazer admitted facilitating the payment of a bribe relating to the 1998 World Cup in France. So it goes further back. It goes
and that has been
even
surprising.
To Europe.
Because I think people thought that this was a newer phenomenon about non-European nations doing it. But yeah, the fact that 1998 is involved, and then the other thing, I mean, it seems to have come out today that FIFA, basically paid off Ireland after they lost access to the World Cup in 2010 because of this famous, basically a handball that Thierry Henry used, and essentially placating a nation that had been denied because of a refereeing error. So the kind of money that was sloshing around, and just the kind of brazenness with which they used money, essentially to sort of silence people, and that kind of sense. Now that it's been exposed, I think people are really surprised by it. I mean, the thing is that people who knew soccer, many people kind of understood that this was really what's going on. And I think a lot of people thought that at some point, really, someone should try to nail this, sort of nail it. I think most people never believed anyone would actually do it. That it seemed like FIFA kind of seemed like they'd had a system that was sort of untouchable. They were a nonprofit. They were in Switzerland. They all sort of got together and protected each other, and it seemed like it was going to be hard to break it open. And then so that when the indictments happened, the kind of surprise was not that this was going on, but that it was actually getting exposed, and then the double surprise with that Sepp Blatter, who had always seemed fairly untouchable and very skilled at insulating himself, then days after being reelected suddenly resigned. I mean, it's been a series of shocks and surprises.
Right, and you mentioned Jack Warner earlier, who is another, he's a former FIFA vice president, and he essentially is threatening to reveal, quote, an avalanche of information on Sepp Blatter and others. He released this bizarre 8-minute paid political advertisement entitled "The Gloves Are Off." There was a bizarre moment during the video when he cited a spoof from the satirical magazine The Onion entitled "FIFA frantically announces 2015 Summer World Cup in the United States," and Warner, thinking that it was a real news article, cited it as proof of the real reason why the U.S. must be going after FIFA, because it was sore about losing the 2022 bid to Qatar for the World Cup. So what does Warner's threat represent? Could he essentially, end up getting Sepp Blatter not just, having resigned or being sort of pressured into resigning, but possibly arrested?
Yeah, I mean, Jack Warner's key here because he obviously was so connected in so many ways to so much of this corruption. I mean, he's a very fascinating figure and has long, again, he's been such a fascinating figure, and people in the Caribbean have known about his corruption for a long time, criticized it. Journalists have covered it. But he's, well, you can see from that, the fact that he cited The Onion as a kind of proof that, there's a lot going on there. And he, I think, was just so tied into so many things that, once this starts to unravel, I think it's really amazing. I mean, it's a kind of like a WikiLeaks almost phenomenon where the kinds of things that I think are going to be exposed, and the kind of brazenness with which people were practicing certain things. I mean, we've already found out about, Chuck Blazer's Trump Tower apartment for his cats. There's all this stuff, and so it's, they're unfortunately they're in the position where a lot of this stuff is going to be just incredible, fodder for social media, for jokes, for because it just seems so absurd. And I think the thing, I think a kind of interesting point about this, right, is that there's these kinds of corruptions are embedded in so many forms, right, of corporate activity and extraction of oil. I mean, so the fact is that the kind of corruption we're seeing with FIFA is in fact, kind of endemic in all kinds of situations. And yet what I think is reason sort of fascinating for people is the contradiction between FIFA, which is after all supposed to be providing a kind of service, a kind of common good for the world. It's a happy thing. It's soccer, right? It's supposed to be this thing, this kind of positive, generous thing. And actually, the founders of FIFA, the originators of the World Cup, had a kind of utopian vision. This is about nations coming together, understanding across borders. It's after World War I that it really gets started, and people are dreaming of kind of non-conflictual ways of national identification, all this stuff, right? And so they're in a sense meant to embody that and sort of offer that. And then the fact that they're doing so in a way that's sort of so venal and and kind of absurd is where the contradiction lies, I think, and what the surprise is about.
One of the big controversies in World Cup soccer lately, even before these arrests, was the situation in Qatar. This is, as you said, it's a small Gulf Arab country. It's very rich, and it is meant to or supposed to host the 2022 World Cup. Whether that will actually happen is now up in the air, but there have been revelations, investigations into the fact that the construction of the stadiums for the World Cup have been fraught with controversy and death. Hundreds of workers, mostly migrant South Asian workers, have died during construction, and there's a Clinton connection to all of this. Former President Bill Clinton led the U.S. bid in 2010 when the U.S. lost to Qatar, and then, of course, there was there was a bit of tension between the two, between Qatari representatives and Clinton. But then, just a few years later, they were cozying up because Qatar made a giant donation to the Clinton Foundation. Is this a tangential issue, or is this also something that's going to start, I think, coming up to the fore?
Well, it's going to come to the fore partly because, people have been eyeing the 2022 World Cup for a while. I mean, first of all, the labor conditions and the migrant deaths are just, are off the charts, and labor activists have been, talking about this for some time. It's, of course, part of a larger problem of exploitation of labor in the Gulf states. It's not just for the stadiums, but I mean, it stands out, or this is a way of exposing it in some ways. I think the other thing about this bid was that it was so obviously, it would be quite different in a way. It was different when France got the World Cup. It was obviously different when Brazil and even South Africa got the World Cup. I mean, for whatever was going on behind the scenes, there was a certain legitimacy to it. You could see why South Africa, which is a country that is deeply, invested in soccer and has been for a long time, why Brazil would host, that Qatar hosted it. Even if it was Egypt or, another Middle Eastern country, it would have seemed different. But here, it just, the contradictions really stood out. Qatar is all over the place in the world of football. I mean, they have these big academies where they're kind of funneling people into European professional leagues. Barcelona, which for a very long time refused to have any corporate sponsorship on their jerseys as a matter of principle because their jerseys represented the Catalan nation, relented, and the Qatar Foundation was the first thing that got on the jerseys of Barcelona. I mean, you can see how they've been at work. They own some teams in Europe, and so this is all also part of just the flow of capital within global soccer, and it's all a piece of that. I mean, I think the Clinton connection is obviously of interest to people because of who the Clintons are. But I mean, that's just one piece among many of the way that this country and its elites have been using money to gain prominence on a global stage. I mean, it's interesting because I remember. The background of this is that there's never been a World Cup in the Middle East, right? And the Middle East is an increasingly important part in FIFA. And so when it first happened, a lot of people, and including me, were like, well, that's, it's nice that there's going to be one in the Middle East. That makes sense. There's never been one, but then as it kind of has unfolded and the way in which this is, if you think about like literally hundreds of people have died building stadiums for a 2022 World Cup that, may not even happen at this point. The politics internally are there's if 2022 doesn't go to Qatar, some other country is going to get it, right? And I wouldn't be surprised at all if part of what's going on behind the scenes is that the U.S. is interested in saying, hey, we can host it in 2022, right? So there is a way. I mean, the politics of this are some of it's good politics in terms of critiquing the labor stuff. The other is that there's going to be an advantage to somebody if Qatar loses its World Cup. It's going to go somewhere else.
And speaking of the increasing role of Arab nations in FIFA, and of course, soccer is a huge sport in the Arab world. It's very popular among Arabs. And, it's, I would say, probably the most popular sport among Arabs. Palestinians have attempted to kick Israel out of FIFA over settlement construction and stuff. It's interesting to see FIFA turn into this political arena, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, it has been a long political. So FIFA has more members than the UN, and that is because there are
Wow.
nations that are acknowledged by FIFA that there are sort of, to be in FIFA you have to have a national soccer federation, which for instance Palestine does. So Palestine is a member of FIFA, is basically considered like a nation by FIFA effectively. They compete, but so are other places. I mean, New Caledonia, which is a kind of territory of France in which there's long been an independence movement, has its own soccer federation and therefore are members of FIFA. This is an artifact of history in some ways, but England has 4 members of FIFA, even though it's one, so Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland. It's long been a site for politics. And actually, the question of Palestine in FIFA has long been a site for clear politics, right? So the support for Palestine, and then once the Palestine Federation is there, critiquing Israel. Israel is part of the European Federation, Palestine part of the Asian Federation, so they don't ever play one another. But in any case, you can obviously see how there, and there's only one case among many. I mean, football and politics have always been really interlinked. South Africa having been was banned from playing for a long time as a part of the anti-apartheid struggle by other African nations, and I mean this has always been part of it. So I think that's kind of key, and I think the other part of this is that Prince Ali of Jordan, who is Blatter's kind of opponent, the most serious opponent in the recent presidential race, is a really interesting figure who may emerge, as some kind of new power broker in this new FIFA context, because among other things, he's the only one among the kind of players in this election who had made a point of talking about women's soccer, for instance. And he was actually behind FIFA reversing a ban. FIFA had a ban that came from Quebec originally on women playing in hijab. And Prince Ali helped to kind of push through a reversal of that ban. So now women can play in hijab, right? So he's been involved in really interesting ways, and not just in men's soccer, but in women's soccer. And so I think we're going to see these regions continue to be vital in FIFA, and the whole scandal kind of creates an opening for some kind of reconfiguration of power within the organization.
There's also then Russia, which is hosting the World Cup in 2018. So the next World Cup will be in Russia, and President Putin, Vladimir Putin, has sort of emerged as FIFA's greatest defender, or the most high-profile defender, and he took the opportunity to accuse the United States of illegally persecuting people. And of course, we know that the backdrop of this is the U.S.'s backing of the Ukrainian government, and tensions between Russia and the West, political tensions between Russia and the West on a number of other issues. Is FIFA just another opportunity for Putin to express his outrage against the U.S., or is there also this fear that Russia might be tainted by the corruption scandal?
I mean, I think it's some of both. Putin's obviously obsessed with his own international image. The Olympics and the World Cup I mean, the thing about these events, right, is that they're not actually that good for countries economically.
Right.
Most of the time, money is spent and it's not made, especially because FIFA has so many kind of absurd requirements about the kinds of stadiums, right? This is why Brazil, which is, a country where people do play soccer, was forced
where the
to
2014
build,
Cup was
for the
held,
2014 World Cup, was forced to build new stadia because they had to look like what FIFA demanded stadia to look like, right?
And now some of them are being used as like parking lots, basically.
Yeah, they're not used for anything, right? So massive expense. That was paid for by Brazilian tax dollars, not by FIFA, right? So the reason people choose these events is essentially that to some extent, it's because the politicians love this kind of thing, right? It's the idea, it's the possibility of being at the center. So for Putin, this is a kind of, FIFA has this problem that the Russia and Qatar World Cup sort of feels like the petrodollars World Cup, right? So both of them feel like these sort of states that are, and I think Putin also, of course, this is an opportunity to attack the United States. The funny thing is that, the interesting thing here is that this is one of those cases where the United States' kind of tendency to maybe overreach or get involved in international things seems at this point to be very, very popular all over the world, right? I mean, so many people have disliked FIFA all over the place in Africa and Asia and so forth that, again, Stephen Colbert made this point before Blatter resigned, was that if the United States, arrested Blatter, they would be kind of heroes and all over the place. So I think Putin is somewhat isolated in that, but Putin's obviously been so cozy with FIFA, and he does not want to lose the 2018 World Cup. I don't think he probably will. But he's obviously threatened by this, and so obviously, accusing the United States of overreach is an obvious response to that.
So finally, there's also, you mentioned that countries don't make money off of this. So taxpayers who spend the money don't benefit, but of course corporations benefit, not just the corporations that are involved in building the stadiums and the infrastructure, but of course those corporations involved in selling the ads, the media corporations involved in, in basically making a lot of money off of this huge industry. Would it be fair to say, just the big picture in the last few minutes of our conversation, that capitalism has destroyed world soccer, global, soccer?
It's always been there's always been a conflict at the heart of these games between, a certain ideal of this as a kind of common form of play, a kind of generous thing, a form of recreation and leisure, and then the money, right, that's come into it, right? And I think with any sport, there's that, and it's just a zone in which that kind of contradiction gets played up in particularly strong ways, and is right now. At the same time, it's the investment in the teams and the investment in the broadcasting that has made the sport the kind of global force it is. So people might be playing soccer all over the place in a certain way without that, but it has become a kind of spectator and a kind of global moment through that. So I think it's a very ambiguous thing. It's very hard to disentangle at this point. People love the World Cup partly because everyone all over the world is watching the World Cup, and everyone's watching it because the media companies have kind of, made that part of what they do. And I think, in the endorsements and the kind of media, the corporate involvement and so forth, is all a piece of that. I think, sort of take, for instance, the Women's World Cup, which is going to be, unfolding starting this weekend for the next month in Canada. This is a competition that has long been, in some ways, gotten far less attention than the others. I raise it just as a case because for those of us who are interested in women's soccer, we're excited that there's a kind of media attention being given
so
to
it's
this
a
game for the first
double-edged
time.
sword, basically.
Yeah, and I think it is. So I think, I am glad that the Fox Sports Channel is paying attention to the women's game. They're doing it because there's money to be made. It's not, a kind of feminist act necessarily, but it does have implications, and it does have good cultural implications. So I think it is really double. And I think the key, though, is to sort of ask what these federations are up to and who they really represent and who they stand for.
Laurent Dubois, thank you so much for a fascinating conversation and for joining us today.
Okay, thank you.
Laurent Dubois is my guest. He's a professor at Duke University, editor of the Soccer Politics blog, and author of Soccer Empire. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. 100 years ago, one of the most important social and political upheavals of the 20th century took place in Mexico. The Mexican Revolution, which started in 1910, was not only significant because of how it shaped Mexico until today, but also because there's a rich history of women soldiers that my guest, Nao Bustamante, has studied and featured in art form. Many women became soldiers or soldaderas in the rebellion and came to be known as Adelitas. A woman named Leandra Becerra Lumbreras, who lived to be 127-year-old and earned the distinction of being the oldest person alive, was also the last survivor of the Mexican War. She died this past March. And my guest, Nao Bustamante, had the chance to meet her. Nao is an associate professor of new media and live art at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York. She has an exhibit entitled Soldadera at the Vincent Price Museum in Southern California, starting in mid-May. And I'm very pleased to welcome her to the program.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
Thanks for joining us. Well, this is a little-known story here in the United States, to hear that there were these women soldiers fighting in the Mexican Revolution. So can you shed some light for our audience? I had certainly never known that this was happening. In what capacity were women part of this war?
Well, they were actually there in every capacity you can imagine. I mean, I think a lot of people imagine that they were sort of supply lines workers, people who were there supplying food, supplying care, medical care. But they were also on horseback. They were also fighting. There were also women who were leading different, groups of people, both men and women. The woman that you spoke of, Leandra Becerra Lumbreras, who was a wonderful spirit. She just passed on March 19th, but I was able to meet her before then, and I was able to go film with her and her family. And she said that she fought with tortillas as opposed to fighting with weapons. So she essentially was leading a group of women who were traveling alongside battalions of men and women, and they were preparing food, caring for the children, and sometimes they would go ahead or behind of the group and set up camp. And they would take with them miniature kitchens with them. So miniature stones and miniature pots and everything so that they could prepare food. They were carrying whole kitchens on their backs. They were foraging for wild food. They were hunting, and they were essentially feeding the army.
Wow. So that was one capacity that they participated in, but were there women on the front lines as well?
There were women on the front lines, and it's interesting because we don't hear a lot about these women. We hear, maybe about one or two, but when I started going through the photo archive, I found many, many photos of women who were brandishing weapons, who were dirty, who had looked like they had been in the field for years, essentially, with the men. And I started being curious about their role in the Mexican Revolution. And I started actually marking this kind of space, this trajectory, particularly through political cartoons and political editorial cartoons, where initially the women appeared very petite and a kind of Victorian era, very like tiny size next to the men in the cartoons. Almost like they were drawn in a different field or a different world. And then as the revolution started to pick up, so around 1914 or so, the women started taking on these kind of monstrous figures with like oversized heads and teeth and really monstrous faces.
Wow.
And then over time, the women became actually looking like they were from the same world as the men in the cartoons. So it was a very bizarre trajectory to follow as an artist, just to follow sort of the visual landscape of the popular, culture that was being produced during the wartime efforts.
So they came to be called, and I mentioned this earlier, as the Adelitas. Tell us about this myth. Is somewhat idealized myth?
Well, the Adelita is often seen in contemporary terms as a kind of, heroic figure, but really a kind of, breasts forward, wind blowing in the hair, holding the flag, and being, this. I guess this kind, almost like a Lady Liberty, I guess, for the Mexican Revolution, but this very sexualized figure and this,
Feminized.
yes, this, I would say even just, feminized, but really sexualized, really like as if the breasts were her guns, right? Just like, moving forward into the world. But really these women were, gritty, they were caring.
And where does that myth come from? I mean, I guess we see that in so many other contexts as well.
Right. I think that a lot of times this is something that's developed by, soldiers and by men who are trying to inspire themselves maybe to carry on and carry forward. So this is something we've seen over and over again in different wartime situations. But part of my interest in this is actually thinking about how to protect women in wartime situations and in frontline situations, because now the frontline has moved over top of women in different kinds of wartime scenarios throughout the world, right? And so what I did was I made these Kevlar fighting costumes, which are made from bullet-resistant Kevlar.
This is part of your performance work in bringing forward this history.
Yeah, and they're also in the exhibition. But really, it's just to imagine or to think about or to time travel these women to protect them against the weapons from that era. So I'm testing these fighting costumes, what I'm deeming fighting costumes, against the weapons that were used between 1910 and 1920 in the Mexican Revolution.
So, when you say that they faced a lot of weapons during war, rape is inevitably a weapon of war. Almost, in any context, whether you're talking about contemporary or historic Mexico, the U.S. or Asia or elsewhere. Did that happen in the Mexican Revolution in terms of, it probably happened, but was it documented? Were the soldaderas particularly targeted?
Well, I think that, yes, rape happens in the context of any society, unfortunately, and it's something that we, have to always stand up against. But I think within the Soldadera units, often what was happening as well was that they were traveling in groups together, large groups of women. So they had a lot more protection than one might have by themselves or located in their own home, even, right? When they were raiding villages. And a lot of times women were swept up in the raids in terms of they had to choose sides because of the urgency of the war, because the war was, in a way, it was improvised, right? It was haphazard. It was improvised. The communication lines weren't always happening, so they didn't always know what one battalion was doing versus another. And so the women had to make snap decisions about which side to join and which side not to join. Zapata had many women following him and with his group because I think he had a very strong reputation for caring for the women and for being respectful to them. And so they really flocked to his battalion and to support his groups. And there were a lot of stories, sort of oral histories about him delivering women back to their own village or back to their own parents or back to their own family.
And how relevant is the history of women in the Mexican Revolution to today? I mean, we know, for example, that there are many women soldiers in the Zapatista Zapatista Army of National Liberation. Is that a tradition that Mexico, I mean, here in the U.S. we may not know much about this history, but how well known is it in Mexico, and how much do people and women in Mexico, put that forward as far as you know?
Well, of course, Mexico is just steeped in the history. They're living inside of it. So their boulevards and their streets are named after these revolutionary fighters and figures that brought forth the new constitution, the new era, the PRI of Mexico, right, which came from the revolutionary fighters. Now, of course, that has shifted over time. And the thing is that it's very similar to many wars and even to the current situation in the United States. Really, they were fighting against what we now refer to as the one percenters, right? But in those times, they were really fighting in feudal states, and they were essentially slaves on the land, right? And a lot of the money that was being generated in Mexico through the wealth of the Mexican resources was taken over by American and European business people. And so, the progress and the things that were being developed in Mexico at the time, like the railroads and infrastructure, were essentially destroyed by the end of the Mexican Revolution. But the Mexican people built it all back up. And, they definitely, changed the literacy rates and the education of the time. So there was a lot of progress made through the Mexican Revolution. I won't say it was for naught. Many people thought it was a hard and bloody 10 years. And they made major gains in terms of, the lives of people and retaining land. In fact, Leandra, she was a woman that at the end of the revolution, she stood in line with her 3 sons who she gave birth to during the time of the revolution.
Wow.
And she got to the front of the line, even though the line was all men, and she said, "My sons were there in the revolution and I want land for them." And she got it. She got it.
This was the 127-year-old woman that you had the chance to meet and interview before she passed away in March, the oldest living human being at the time of her death, and
Yes.
also the oldest survivor of the Mexican Revolution. Were women, as far as you know, involved in the writing of the Constitution? What happened to them after the war? Women like Leandro got some land, but were they involved in the sort of political future of Mexico?
Well, they were. They didn't really want to go backwards at that point. And I think that happens a lot of times times you'll see in
Sure.
history during wartime situations where women are essentially called on to take up the slack, right, or do jobs or support the war effort. They find themselves having more agency than they had previously, and they don't want to go back. So that was a really important time for women because they found that they had respect, they had positions, they were taken, just out of the role of caring for the family, caring for the house, caring for children, and they liked that. And so I think that was a really important time for women's liberation movements in Mexico.
Now, let's talk about art, since you are primarily an artist, and the exhibits that you're involved in currently at the Vincent Price Museum, or it will be starting May 16th, and then going to Buffalo, New York at the end of September for our East Coast audiences. How important is art as a form for reviving some of this history?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that history lives in books, and history lives in stories that are told to individuals and told through families. But art is a way to bring all of this together and to sort of re-envision, reimagine, create a new entrance into the conversation. And that's part of what I wanted to do with my art practice, was really just to begin the conversation, imagine these different lives of women, and allow people to enter with their own imaginations these different stories that are being told in the exhibition, through the films that I'm creating, through the costumes, through the photo collages. But really, it's just a conversation that I want to keep extending. And after visiting Leandra and her family, I found what I had on my hands was actually documentary footage. And so I'm actually moving forward in creating a documentary about women in this wartime. The jumping off point is women in the Mexican Revolution, but we can expand that to look at contemporary women and the kind of trials they face and the kind of protections they need. And so I'm working on a futuristic fighting costume, which of course will be absurd because nobody could possibly be protected against contemporary war. And that's part of, I guess, what the art is trying to say, is that we can't protect ourselves against war. Our only option is to get rid of war.
So a little bit more on the costumes that you made for the current exhibit that we were talking about earlier. These dresses made of Kevlar, which is a bulletproof material. You made these dresses in the sort of in the actual period piece, and they're historically accurate. And then what did you do with them?
Well, the first dress that I made, we called it Tierra y Libertad, which is a cry of the Mexican Revolution, right? Land and liberty. And we took them into the field and we shot them with weapons from the era, from the Mexican Revolution. And we tested them, and they actually stopped a 9mm slug.
Wow.
Twice.
Wow.
So the apron of the dress, which had multi-layers of Kevlar, which was protecting the heart and the internal organs, was able to stop 2 9mm slugs. And so, the dress was tested somewhat, weapons grade tested as they called it, but not in a scientific manner.
And so your point was to sort of, in 100 years after these events happened, preserve these women?
Yes, it was a way of sort of time traveling to protect them, to go back in time and say, we appreciate what you did. We understand what you did. We understand why you did it. And we want to protect you, right? And so there was a way in which visiting Leandra was also a kind of time travel experience, just to actually touch her, to touch somebody who was alive, materially alive in 1910 and there participating, was really wild. And she was this amazing person, this amazing figure that kind of lived between history and the living moment.
There's also another work that you've done related to the Mexican Revolution. Among the many depictions of the history of Mexico and the Mexican Revolution is the 1930 film project by famed Russian filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein called Que Viva Mexico. And the film was never finished, but you imagined a new ending or a new chapter for the film. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, oddly, this is weird because, oddly, when I was looking through the archives and trying to find the women in the archives, it was then another scholar came to me and said, "Well, you've heard of the unfinished film of Eisenstein, right? Soldadera." And I said, "No, I haven't heard of this." And essentially, he made a film that he produced for about 3 months in Mexico in the 30s, and it was later cut and released in different kind of tourist montages, but also as a film called Que Viva Mexico. And there was one section he was unable to finish because he lost funding. There were different rumors circulating about him, why he had to go back to Russia. But he lost funding, and he was unable to record the section called Soldadera. Oddly, because here was somebody who was trying to bring them attention, and even that was cut short.
And so this
and even that film wasn't able to be made. But there was a script that existed.
Oh, wow. How did you find that?
Well, it's widely available in his writings, and so I ended up taking parts of the script and parts of my script and kind of smooshing them together and making a kind of psychedelic reenactment of the film. And so there's parts of that in there, and parts, of course, from my own ideas, and then the backdrops are the archival photos from the UC Riverside Special Collections.
And so, even just a few years after the end of the Mexican Revolution, when someone attempted to, in film form, memorialize the role of women, somehow that part got left out.
It did, but the really interesting and bizarre thing is that in filming Leandra, I've been working with this footage of her, and in it she's speaking to a woman named Pancha or Panchita. Often she's talking to this woman, Pancha, Panchita, leave that, let me help you with this. And Eisenstein's main character in his script was named Pancha, Panchita. So there are some really interesting kind of circles that are coming together in the work. So I'm in some kind of artistic vortex, pulling in all these elements of history and, trying to pull something together for the public.
And how important is it now, as we wrap up our conversation, for us to remember, particularly at our current time when, even though women have made so many gains worldwide, they are still the primary victims of violence and war. I mean, even in Mexico itself, women who've been disappeared and raped and murdered, the economic violence that they face every day, to remember these important moments in history, can that influence the present?
I hope so. I mean, we look at a time where women had agency, and it's beyond disturbing to think about the ways in which women are seen as expendable and seen as property all over the world. And so, in places like here in the United States where we do have agency, where we do have our independence, really important for us to speak up for women in other locations that don't have that voice and to try to help them. But, I think I don't really understand it. I mean, I would like to believe that in my lifetime that I'll see a kind of, second enlightenment or a way towards peace. I don't know if it's greed. I don't know if it's psychosis of some sort. I don't know what it is that keeps people marching towards killing each other, abusing each other. I don't understand it. But I would like for us to be able to work towards ending that cycle of violence, particularly towards women.
And also in terms of how we see women being, and I mentioned the sort of economic injustice that they're fighting against, going back to the premise of the Mexican Revolution as being a fight against the 1%ers. Even though women have agency here in the United States, poor women are suffering from a severe state repression in terms of welfare recipients being drug tested, women being imprisoned, women being victims of police violence, and the victims of campus rapes. It can get kind of depressing.
It can get really depressing. And I think our only choice is just to keep these women who have fought so hard in our mind and just continue to march forward and to march towards justice. And we know what that is. Everyone knows what that is in their heart. They know what economic justice looks like, and they know what social justice looks like. And we need to just continue to march towards that no matter what.
How did you get involved? How did you find this topic, or did it find you?
Well, it found me, as does most of my art practice, and bizarrely, it came out of me appearing on a reality show on Bravo called Work of Art, America's Next Great Artist.
Wow.
I know, strange, right? And so I was on this show, it was 2009 it aired, and I sort of hit the mainstream, and I was getting all these sort of slings and arrows, both good and bad commentary, passed to me. And a lot of the commentary was really just disgusting remarks about my body, primarily, in a kind of troll situation. And I thought, I would love to create a talisman. And I imagined this dress that was all the way up to the neck, all the way down on my sleeve, so that was made of Kevlar. And then within those 2 days, someone invited me to make work about the Mexican Revolution for a show. These curators, Marcus Quila Nazario and Pilar Perez, invited me to be in a show called From Chewbacca to Zapata, Re-Envisioning the Mexican Revolution. And so I started doing a little bit of research, and I found these women fighters that were wearing the same clothes as the dress I imagined making for myself. And so at that point, I decided I'm going to go back in time and try to protect these women.
That's a really personal story. That's amazing. And of course, that is also an important issue that today, despite the fact that women have so much agency, have the social media and the internet, women are often attacked verbally in horrible ways.
Yes.
And it's cruel, and it's a symptom of the kind of disgusting misogyny and sexism that pervades our culture. And I'm so glad to see a woman like you fighting back.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and best of luck to you and all the work that you're doing.
Thank you, and thank you for your work also.
My guest is Nao Bustamante. She is an associate professor of new media and live art at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York. And for our Southern California audience, her exhibit at the Vincent Price Museum entitled Soldadera will be opening May 16th. For our East Coast audience, later in the year in September, she's going to be showing in Buffalo, New York. We'll post all of the details at our website, uprisingwithsonali.com. And this is Uprising. By the way, do subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're online at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Every subscription that we get sustains the TV production of Uprising. It costs money to put this program on your screen. And if you are a TV viewer, do consider subscribing for a very small monthly fee. This is Uprising. Anna Buss is our assistant producer, and she is also our technical director today, along with Daniel Swerdlove. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Federico Garcia is our audio engineer. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Again, that YouTube channel is online at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com, where you can find all of the information that we mentioned on the air. I hope to see our Southern California listeners at the Chris Hedges Truth Dig event this Sunday. More information at kpfk.org. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kohutker, host and executive producer of Uprising. Have a wonderful weekend. I'll see you Monday.